The mixer brush was added to Photoshop a few versions ago, and it allows for very painterly-like effects. In essence, making you an artist more than just someone using Photoshop to correct images. If I go to the paintbrush tool and right-click or click and hold for a few seconds, at the bottom is the mixer brush tool. And in order to really see what the mixer brush tool does, let's take a look at a simple canvas, and then we'll move on to painting over an image. I'm going to start with a natural bristle brushes. These are natural media brushes, so you have the brush styles that you might use with real acrylic paint or watercolor paint. There's even charcoal options, airbrush options. But as I go up to the top, I'm going to start with the fan high bristle count. So you'll see flat fan high bristle count, and I'm going to dial my brush size up to about 25. I'll click this safe area to make that go away. It removes our brush picker. And if you have an accelerated video card, you'll see a sample of the style brush that you're painting with, not just the tip, but the full brush from a side view. And I'm going to choose several different brush styles. We'll start with dry. And when I select dry, I'm going to go to swatches and choose the first red in the top row. Now when I start with dry, it's mostly going to paint with this solid red. So it's a dry brush just loaded with the paint, so it's not going to pick up a lot of colors on the canvas. As I click and drag across, there you could see separation in the bristles, but it really didn't pull any of the yellow color into the blue or the blue into the white. If I switch to a moist brush and do the same paint stroke, here you could see it's starting from red, then blending the red and the yellow, then the yellow to the blue, and the blue to the white. And as I go to wet, it's going to be just like working with real media. Your stroke may get a little bit thinner, and it should be mixing more of the colors. And I could finish off with very wet. Now, just to explain what these settings are, the wet setting picks up more ink from the canvas or your image and spreads that across the image. The dry doesn't pick up much ink, it uses mostly the color that you've selected. Now there are settings for this. There's a load setting. Load is basically how much ink is on the brush. So if you have a low load percentage, it runs out of paint faster. A higher load keeps more of your original paint color for more strokes. And then the mix keeps more of the loaded color when you have a lower mix value. A higher mix picks up more of the inks or colors on the canvas or the colors in your image. And the last two things I should point out are these two buttons. Load the brush after each stroke and clean the brush after each stroke. If I turn off load the brush after each stroke and click and drag and paint, I got none of the red. It started with transparent, then it's pulling some of the yellow into the blue and the blue into the white. If I turn on load the brush, when I click and drag, it will start with the red and paint as we were doing earlier. Now if I turn off clean the brush after each stroke, as I click and drag, it is pulling some of the last color. When I clicked and dragged to make the first stroke, it didn't clean here, so the white that was picked up on the end, as if it were wet paint on a canvas, started at the beginning of the next stroke. So you can use some of the wonderful presets that are built in and experiment with wet, load, mix. But now let's apply this to image data. So I've got this green door image, and instead of painting with a solid color, I've made a new layer called Paint. On that new layer, I'm going to choose Sample All Layers. And then I'll press Shift-Tab. Shift-Tab will hide the panels on the right, so I have more territory for painting. I'll zoom in a few times with Command plus or Control plus, and to use this on an image, you first want to start with the Option or Alt key. almost treating it like the clone stamp tool. When I hold down Option or Alt and click once, it loads that portion into the brush itself. So if I want to paint over these blinds, it's picking up the color and tone, and I use Command Z or Control Z a lot when I'm doing this, to turn this into a painted image. I can hold down Option or Alt, click once, and keep sampling from different parts of the image. I usually do all the inner blinds first, then trace around the outside. So that's the first part of the inner, but you could do the rest. And then you could vary your brush styles. Maybe the next brush I want to choose is the flat point medium stiff. And I can click away to see the size and use my right bracket key on my keyboard to make the brush bigger or smaller. And now I will Option or Alt click to sample some of this portion of the image. And that might work if I Option or Alt click and drag across here for top and bottom. But to go the opposite direction, I will bring up the Brushes panel and change my angle to either +90 or -90. And now I can Option or Alt click and paint down, or use my right bracket to make the brush bigger, and I love this trick. Option or Alt click, click once, scroll down to the very bottom, Shift click at the end, and it just kind of catches up with you. But I do find myself experimenting often with different brush styles and brush shapes and moving over to the canvas to see if I've picked one that I like. There are some really wild patterns that each of these will make. This one is kind of interesting, the first round point stiff. Again, I'll Option or Alt click. I can click and drag, and you could see it blending the colors. Or for this image that's made up of a lot of lines, I can Option or Alt click, click once, and Shift clicking connects the dots. So I can get a lot of connections by clicking and Shift clicking, and it will blend as it paints down. Now the last couple brushes I want to show, but I do want you to experiment with all of these, is when I have an area that has a lot of detail, I really found that the round watercolor works the best. So when I choose round watercolor, I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and sample the black from the number 2, and then just start painting around. And you can see it's mixing a little bit of the green and the black, and it will do different things depending on whether you drag left or right or up and down. It works great for the doorknob as well. Option or Alt click, and then I could paint in a circular fashion that doorknob. If I don't like it, just hit Command Z or Control Z. Option or Alt click on the lock, and you could do a couple small clicks, but then I could paint around the lock. Hold down spacebar to move my screen. Option or Alt click to load the mail slot, and I'm just painting over areas of detail. I use this watercolor brush for most of the bricks, the background image, the fans for the inside, but I varied with many of the different brush styles that are available up here. So let's take a look at my finished work. If I open the end piece, here is where I went with that image. And if I fit in Window and press Shift-Tab, this is all safely protected on a paint layer. Because we were starting with a completely blank layer and we chose Sample All Layers, it pulled the data and color from the background layer and put it on the paint layer. So I can see where I've come so far here, and I'll go up to the other image, before and after. Just a really artistic impression of a still photo. So experiment with all the natural bristle types on the mixer brush and see what artwork you can create. I find this is a beautiful present to do for family members over a portrait of them that they really like, to perfect that image or give them your impression of that photograph.